Okay. Then let's get started. So today
Okay.
we'll be doing user-defined functions. So what is a function? A function, you have come across many functions so far. Some of
Hmm.
them were your println function to print a statement. Then you came
Hmm.
across mathematical functions like floor, ceil, pow, sqrt.
Hmm.
Okay. So these functions were built-in functions. That means they are provided by,
Okay, just 1 minute. 1 minute.
yeah, sure.
हाँ सुवर्णन। और सर अभी एक नया लिंक भेजे हैं। अभी भेजे हैं, अरे हैंगआउट में भेजे हैं। अरे जीमेल में जो हैंगआउट नहीं होता क्या मेरे तो बगल। हाँ हाँ, वहाँ पर भेजे, हमेशा तो वहीं पर भेजते हैं।
Is he coming?
Yes sir, is coming.
Okay, then let's wait.
मिला? Yes sir, it's trying to come now. It's coming.
Okay. Okay, shall we start now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So as I was saying that we have come across the term functions. We have come across this word. Okay, just a second. Okay. So we have come across this term function previously. We have seen many built-in functions. We have seen many built-in functions like we have seen println. Println is a built-in function which we use regularly. We have seen functions like pow. We've seen functions like seal, floor, etc. So these are built-in functions. That means they're provided by Java to us so that we can use them without knowing about their internal details. And this has been written by someone else. The designers of Java, the developers of Java, they have already written this function for us so that we can use them directly without having to worry about the implementation. But now, at times, it is observed that the built-in functions are insufficient, and we have to define functions of our own. Such functions which we define by ourselves are known as user-defined functions. Okay. Now, user-defined functions are mainly of two types. User-defined functions are mainly of two types. One is member functions, and the other is non-member functions. Okay. Now, member functions, if you remember the concept of classes and objects from our introductory sessions, then you would be able to recollect that member functions are used to implement the behavior of objects. The behavior of objects is implemented using member functions, and since they're used to implement behavior of objects, they are associated with objects as well. Associated with objects. And what about non-member functions? Non-member functions will not be associated with objects, not be associated with any object. So whenever you're invoking a member function, you will have to do it on an object. A member function is always invoked on an object, whereas a non-member function is invoked directly. So we will be taking up member functions when we start writing our own classes. Like we have been writing classes ourselves, but when we take up the programming aspect of classes and objects, then we'll be dealing with member functions. For now, in today's class, we'll be focusing our attention on non-member functions. So up to this point, do you have any questions to ask? You may go ahead. If you have any doubts, you may ask. So I guess nobody has any doubts and I can proceed. Now let's take an example of a function. So let me write a class for you. Let's call this class demo. And now, of course, I'll have a main function. This is my main function. And what I want to do is my objective for defining this demo class is to add two numbers. So you know how to add two numbers. That's quite trivial for you now. But I want to add two numbers using a function of my own. That means when I say a function of my own, I'm referring to a user defined function. So I want to add two numbers using a user defined function. So let's see how it's done. Okay. Now the first thing that I need to do is, okay, I need to import the scanner class, right? Because I want user input. So let me do that. So that the scanner class is under the util package. So I'll just import that. I'll import the scanner class. This will enable me to accept user input. Now let me define the scanner object. So I'll call it scanner. Yeah. So this will create an object of the scanner class. And next, what will I do? I will ask the user for inputs. So let's say the first input I'm storing in num1. So before storing the input, I'll just prompt the user to print a value. So I'll say, so I want to start from a new line. So I say \n. So this will take me to a new line. I'll ask the user to enter a number. And seeing this statement on the execution window, the user will enter a value, and I want to store that value in num1. To store that value in num1, what will I do? I'll write scan dot next int. So this will enable me to store the input that the user has given in this variable num1. Similarly, I will be asking the user for a second input. So I'll say enter another number, and I'll store it in a variable num2. Now after I'm done with this, what will I do? I will call a function. I will call a function. Now remember, every function has a name. Like you see here, every function is referred to by its name and a pair of parentheses. This pair of parentheses denotes that the name that you see here, like println or pow, these names are functions. So how are you able to identify a function? You're able to identify a function using pair of parentheses. This is what you use to identify a function. So now, so remember, so a function will have two parts. It will have a name and it will have a pair of parentheses, so that we can understand, or so that the Java execution environment can understand that the name is that of a function. And one more thing, what would be present inside this pair of parentheses? Inside this pair of parentheses, what you would have are arguments to the function. What you would have are arguments to the function. You would have arguments to the function. So you can think of arguments to a function as inputs to the function. You can think of arguments as inputs to the function. And remember, every function, not every function, functions can return values. Functions can return values or print statements. Now, just think about it. A function is this box, okay? The function is this box. Now, in this box, you will put something. Now, depending on what you put inside this box, you will be getting some results. So what you're putting inside this box is your input to the function, and that is specified using arguments. And what you are getting from the function is in the form of, like, whatever you're getting out of the function, that is the output from the function, and the output can be specified in two ways. The output from a function can be specified using return value of the function, or it can be specified by printing the output itself. Okay, so you can you can have the output from a function in two ways. Either you make that function return a value, you make the function return a value, in that way you can produce output from the function, or you print the output in the function itself. So these are the two ways in which you can produce output from a function. So if you're printing the output, if you are printing the output, then there is a concept called return type. There is a concept called, okay, sorry about that. There's a concept called return type of function. Return type of function. Now, this return type, this return type of function, this is nothing but the output of the function. The way you're trying to generate output from a function is decided by the return type of the function. The way you're generating output from a function is decided by the return type of the function. So if the return type, if the return type happens to be any of the built-in types, if the return type happens to be any of the built-in data types, any of the built-in data types like int, float, char, etc., then you say that the function has a return value. That means the function is going to return a value to the function which called it. Okay. The function will produce an output in the form of return value if the return type is one of the built-in types. And if the return type happens to be void, if the return type happens to be void, that means the function will be producing output by printing the output value. The function will be producing the output by printing the output value if the return type is void. And remember one thing, it's not necessary for a function to always produce an output, okay? But more often than not, you will have functions which will definitely accept inputs and which will produce outputs. Again, even accepting inputs is not compulsory. You may have functions which do not take any arguments. Those functions are also possible. You may have functions which do not take any arguments. Even that is possible. But more often than not, you will have functions which take at least one input and which produce outputs as well. So up to this point, is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir, it's clear.
Okay, great. So moving on to the program, moving on to the program. So what do I want? I want to add two numbers, but I want to do that using a function of my own. So what I do is I call this function. If you want to use the function, if you want to use the function, what you need to do is you need to call the function. Now, how do you call the function? You call the function by writing the name of the function. So I write the name of the function. Let's say the name of my function is add. The name of a function will be any legal identifier. I hope you remember the rules of identifiers, the rules that you keep in mind
Yes,
for
sir.
naming variables.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Same, the same rules you need to keep in mind for naming functions. So you write, so to call a function or to use a function, what you do is you call the function. Remember, to use function, call the function. Okay. So to use a function, we need to call the function. And how do you call the function? You write the name of the function. You write the name of the function, and within this pair of parentheses, so you need to, whenever you're calling a function, you need to mention the pair of parentheses. If the function does not take any input, that means if the function is not accepting any arguments, whatever goes inside this pair of parentheses, they are known as arguments. So if the function is not accepting any arguments, you will leave this pair of parentheses empty. You will leave them empty. But if the function is accepting arguments, then you need to pass the arguments here. So what should be the input to my function? The input to my function should be num1 and num2. That should be the input. Now let's say I want this function to return a value. I want this function to return a value, to produce output in the form of a return value. So what will I do? I will write int sum equal to this. That means whatever value this function will return, whatever value this function will return, I will store it in a variable sum. See, whenever a function is returning value, you have to store that return value somewhere. Now, to store the return value of a function, you need to have a variable on the left hand side of the function call. This is the function call, okay? This statement is the function call. Now, whenever, again I repeat, whenever a function is returning a value, you need to store the return value in a variable on the left hand side of the function call. Fine. Now, after I have the return value in this variable called sum, what do I need to do? I need to print the return value, right? So let me try to print. Let me try and print the return value. So the return value is the sum. So I'll say, I want to print it on a new line. So I'll say sum is, and I'll simply print the value of sum. Okay. Now you might be wondering that your job is over, but it's actually not. Why? Because you have not implemented the function. Remember, you have simply written statements to use the function. This is a statement where you will be using the function. But remember, merely writing a statement which will invoke the function or which will call the function is not enough. You have to define the function yourself. That means you have to specify how the function will operate. Now, in order to do that, what you need to do is you need to write the function definition. You need to write the function definition. So how do you write the function definition? Like here, you have defined your main, right? This is the definition for main. Similarly, you have to write the definition for sum. So how do you write the definition for sum? Firstly, you need to specify the return type. What is the return type of this function add? See, it's returning a value. So it will have a return type. What kind of value is it returning? It's returning an integer value because it is summing up two integers. It's returning an integer value as well. So it all depends on the way you are implementing it. I have implemented the function in such a way that I am going to make it return an integer value. Since I'm making it return an integer value, I'll have to specify the return type as int. So how do you write this? So you write the name of the function. Now, this function is taking how many inputs? This function is taking two inputs. So this function is taking two inputs. So you need to write two variables here. You need to declare two variables separately, mind you. So I'll write int x comma int y. If you think that since x and y are two variables of the same type, that is int, and you can write something like this, then you are mistaken. You cannot write anything like this. In a function definition header. So what I'm writing here, this entire thing, this is the function definition header. Now in the function definition header, all arguments have to be declared separately. All arguments have to be declared separately. Just keep that in mind. Okay. So since I
So
have
what is this function definition header?
this header which I'm writing, this part, this is called the function definition header. Okay. So I haven't finished writing it. I haven't finished writing. So let me just complete this. So the function definition header will contain the name of the function, the list of arguments. This may be empty as well if the function is not accepting any inputs. And it will contain the return type. So what is the return type of this function? What kind of value will the function be returning? The function will be returning an int value. So before the name of the function, I will write int. That means this function is returning an int value. This function is returning an int value. And what kind of function is calling sum? See, main is calling sum. In fact, main is the name of the function is add. I'm sorry, it won't be sum, it will be add. Sorry about that. So my main function here is calling my add function. It's calling my add function. Now, since it's calling my add function, I have to keep one thing in mind. What is the type of main? The type of main is void. The return type of main is void. That's fine. But it is also a static function. And remember, static functions can invoke only other static functions. That means I have to define add as static. So add has to be static. The meaning of static will be clear to you as we progress along in our lesson on functions. But for now, just keep in mind that a static function can invoke only other static functions. Okay, since main is calling my add function has to be defined as static. Okay. Now, I guess this part is clear. The function definition header. The function definition header is clear. Any doubts you can ask. Okay. One more thing that you must keep in mind as far as this argument list is concerned. This is the argument list. Okay. This is the argument list, and the argument list is sometimes called the function signature. This is called the function signature. Remember, the argument list is sometimes called the function signature. And the values that we pass to a function, the values passed to function. Now, by values, what I mean is either variables or constants. Okay, either variables or constants. So here I have passed two variables, num1 and num2. I can pass constants as well, or I can pass one variable and one constant. That is also allowed. So values passed to function are called arguments. So here num1 and num2 are arguments, and these are called simply arguments or actual arguments. The values that you pass, and the variables that you write in the function definition header. That means the variables that you write in the function signature, to be more specific. So in the function signature, remember, in function signature, you can have only variables. And these are known as parameters, or sometimes they're known as formal parameters. Okay, so just keep these terms in mind. So here x and y are your formal parameters. And these are also at times called actual parameters. And these are sometimes called formal arguments. Okay, so I hope this part is clear. Now, what happens is, remember, one more thing that you must keep in mind is that the names that you use for your actual arguments, may be the same as the names of your formal arguments. That means instead of writing x and y, I can also write num1 and num2 here as well. There won't be a problem. Why? because num1 and num2 that I'm using here in the function call, the num1 and num2 that I'm using here in the function call has been declared inside main. They have been declared inside main. But this num1 and num2, this num1 and this num2 has been declared in the function add. So there will be no collision. There will be no collision since num1 and num2 has been declared inside main, and this num1 and this num2 has been declared inside add. There will be no collision. There will be no problem as such. Okay, fine. Now what you do is, so you can have, when you're writing multiple functions, then those functions may have, or they may use, the same variable names. Whenever you're writing multiple functions, they may use the same variable names with certain exceptions, which we'll see later on. But more often than not, you will have different functions using the same variable names without any problems, because variables are declared locally to a function. When variables are declared locally to a function, those variables are visible within the function in which they're declared. That means if I declare 5 variables inside main, those variables will be available only inside the main function. If I declare 3 variables inside my add function, those variables will be exclusively available to the add function. Okay, moving on. So my job was to accept 2 inputs in this function. So I'm getting those inputs in num1 and num2, and my job is to add them. So I can say int sum. See, I'm using sum again, no problem, because I'm using it inside add. This sum which I'm using inside add and this sum which has been used inside main, these two are different variables, because the sum variable inside main is local to the main function, and this sum variable inside add is local to the add function. So what I do is I say int sum equal to, I'll simply add it up. I'll say num1 plus num2. And what will I do? See, what is the return type of this function? The return type of this function is int. That means this function has to return a value. In the output will be in the form of a return value. So how do you specify a return value? You write the keyword return and you mention the variable which you are returning. So which variable are you returning? You're returning sum. So you write return sum. The value or the parameter or the entity which you are returning need not always be a variable. That means in place of sum, I can also return 1, although it won't make much sense in this program, but you can return constants as well. Just keep that in mind. So we can return variables as well as constants. So that's how the sum value will be returned, and you will get the result here. So just try to understand how this program will be executed. See, first the user enters a number, and that is stored in num1. Let's say the user enters 5. Let's say just for an example, let's say the user enters 5. And in the second case, the user enters 15. Now what will happen? Now let's see how the function behaves, how the function call behaves. So what are you doing? You're passing num1. What is num1? 5. What is num2? 15. So when you're calling this function add and passing num1 and num2, what will happen? A copy operation will take place. So num1 will be stored inside this variable num1. So let me just change the name so that it will be easier for me to explain. Although it doesn't make much difference. It doesn't make much difference whether, in fact, not much difference. It doesn't make any difference whatsoever, whether I use same variable names or not. So I'll just change the variable name so that you can understand better. So it's easier for me to explain. So what will happen is, so 5, which is stored in num1, will be copied to the first variable which is present in my argument list. Which is the first variable? X. So there'll be a corresponding copy operation. So the first value that is passed is stored in the first variable, that is X. The second value which is passed, that is num2, 15, is stored in the second parameter Y. So 5 is stored in X and 15 is stored inside Y. Now you add it up. You add X and Y. What is the value of X? The value of X is 5 and the value of Y is 15. So you add 5 and 15. What do you get? You get 20. And that 20 is now stored in sum. Now what are you saying? You're saying return sum. So when you say return sum, it means that the value of sum, which is 20, will be returned to this function call. Now, since this function call is getting a return value from the function add, it is expected to have a variable on the left hand side. This variable on the left hand side will be able to store the return value. So 20 is returned and it is stored in sum, and then the value of sum is printed. Is the execution part clear?
So I do not understand the last few lines which you have written.
Return sum.
Yes, sir.
Okay. See, the calculation I guess is understood. Now currently sum contains 20. Now you're saying return sum. When you're saying return sum, it means that the value of the variable sum, which in this case is 20, is returned to the function call. Where is the function call? The function call is here. This is the function call. Now, since this function call is getting a return value, what will happen? The function call is expected to have a variable on the left hand side. The function call is expected to have a variable on the left hand side to be able to store this return value. You need a variable to store this return value. That's why I have written int sum on the left hand side. Is it understood now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So 20 is stored in sum. And so remember that whenever a function has a return type other than void, it will return a value. And on the left hand side of the function call, we need to have a variable of the same type. That means this function add is returning a value of type int. So whenever I'm going to invoke this function add, I need to have an int variable on the left hand side, which will be able to store the return value. And keep one more thing in mind, that whatever you're writing for return, this expression, see, here I've written what? Return sum. What did I tell you? It's not necessary to always return a variable. You can also return a constant, although it makes no sense here. But one more thing that you must keep in mind is, instead of returning variables and constants, you can also return expressions. So here, just to reduce the size of the program, see, what is sum? Sum is x plus y. So instead of declaring a variable called sum and then having it store the sum of x and y, we can directly write return x plus y. Even that is allowed. Okay, let me not erase it. Let me just comment this out. So even expressions like x plus y, any valid expressions which will give you an output, any valid expression which will give you a value, which will give you an output, which is of the same type as the return type of the function. I repeat, whenever you are writing an expression, a legal expression, it should yield an output which is of the same type as the return value of the function, which in this case is int. So if I add x and if I add it with y, if I add x and y, what will I get? I'll get an integer value which is of the same type as the return value of add. So this kind of expressions is perfectly legal and we should use them more often in order to make our programs more compact. So is this part clear?
Yes, sir.
Suvarnim, any doubts?
No, sir.
Okay, then let's try to execute this program. So just give me a minute. just one thing, since we're using the scanner input inside main, it's best to write this statement inside the main method itself, okay? Because we're using it to accept input in the main function. Just keep that in mind. That's one little change that we needed to make. Can you see the black screen?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Now,
Yes.
Yes, sir.
so you see, I have executed this program. I've accepted it. I've accepted two numbers, 15 and 5, and I've got the correct result as 20. So we can try it with other values as well. So let's say I have 156 and 6. The sum is 162. Is this understood?
Yes, sir.
Just go through the program once. If you have any doubts, you can ask. Any questions?
No, sir.
Okay, so we have no questions so far. Okay, now this kind of a function that you saw, see, functions, user-defined functions, you can categorize them into a few types based on your understanding, based on your convenience. It's just to make you understand things better. See, one type is when a function takes arguments as well as returns value. See, this is a function which takes arguments as well as returns values. You can also have functions which do not take arguments but return a value. I'll just write it down for you. So you can simply categorize. See, this is no, what can I say? This is no formal classification of functions, but just to make things easier, what people do is they categorize functions into various groups based on the arguments and return types of the function. Based on the arguments and return types of the function, they categorize functions into various groups. So that is what I'm trying to do now. Okay, so I think we are coming to an end of for this meeting. So what I'll do is I'll send you a new link. Okay.
Okay.